Welcome back. This is English 212B. I'm Professor Patchell. Today I'm going to give a little micro lecture on Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. The title of my lecture is The Yellow Wallpaper, Critique of Patriarchy. First of all, just a little bit about patriarchy. Patriarchy is a male-dominant system, and it is a system. It's a historical system. It's a social system. It's a system that is based and centered on the male perspective, the male experience. To somebody like Gilman, a writer like Gilman, this is the system that we have all inherited, that we are all in patriarchy, and we are all suffering the effects of patriarchy through Gilman's point of view. So we want to keep that in mind. And patriarchy to Gilman is oppressive. It's universal. It's everywhere. It's systematic. It affects every part of our lives. And to Gilman's point of view, patriarchy, which literally means father first, is a system that has caused countless woes for the human race, and particularly for women who are within patriarchy. This is a subject that Gilman lectured on during her life. She wrote essays, but perhaps her most famous work is this strange short story called The Yellow Wallpaper. I want to thank Professor Bernstein for her two micro lectures that we are guests of, and you should check those out. One of the points that she makes, and I want to make this really clear, I want to re-emphasize what she says. This is Professor Bernstein, is that, remember, this is a work of fiction. This is not to be taken as autobiographical, even though it was influenced by an experience that Gilman herself endured. This story is a fictionalized version of that. And Gilman did not go over the edge like our narrator in The Yellow Wallpaper goes over the edge. So, patriarchy and The Yellow Wallpaper. This story takes the form of a secret journal that we are all sort of intruding on. You know, the narrator in The Yellow Wallpaper, who's writing this journal, sometimes she does sort of refer to us. It's almost like she's aware. And this is something that you might think about. You know, who is her audience? When people write journals, especially a secret journal or a secret diary or secret logbook, we think, you know, they're personal. They're for themselves. So really, in some ways, do we have the right to be reading this? We're coming into somebody else's secret world. But this narrator seems to be aware that somebody is reading, and at points even says, you know, I can't tell you this right now. I don't even want to tell you. She could be talking to her journal, but she could also be talking to us, our sense of audience. These are things that we talk about in English classes. We talk about the two ideas of purpose and audience. So you might think about that in your own writing. You know, when you write something, what is your purpose and who is your audience? I know that when I'm doing this type of work, you are my audience, the class, the students, right? And my purpose is to inform you, to make you think, to sort of open works up to you a little more than maybe you will do on your own. But that is my end goal, is to get you making these ideas happen and discoveries on your own. So let's get into it. It's a secret journal being written by an unnamed woman who's undergoing what is called the rest cure. And this was a cure for women with depression, mostly postpartum depression, type of depression that women go through after childbirth. And our narrator has a baby. And you'll notice that the baby is very peripheral to the story. It's almost like the mother and baby have been separated. The baby is not with her. And it's just another thing that the doctor, who is her husband, his name is John, thinks that might stress her, right? That if she has too much contact with the baby, and also that she's not supposed to write. That's why she's writing this journal in secret. She's not supposed to do much of anything except for just lay in bed and rest. Okay. So imagine the effects. Sometimes I feel like that wouldn't be such a bad thing, laying around in bed all day. But many studies and many psychological looks at these types of situations show that depression is often related to not having a purpose in life. And this strange narrator, her only purpose is to get well. And I want to just draw some attention to the fact that, yes, her husband and her brother are doctors, especially during Gilman's time. Being a doctor or a physician would be a traditionally male pursuit. There's lots of jokes and stories where where the whole idea hinges on the fact that, you think of a doctor, it's going to be a man. Now we know this not to be true, and we have thankfully lots of adequate and experienced and skilled female doctors in our society. But this wasn't the case so much in the time of the yellow wallpaper. And doctors historically have not been so friendly to women, particularly because they were not the focus, right? In fact, depression in Gilman's time was also related to what they call hysteria, which could cover any range of psychological problems. But the term itself, hyster, comes from the term uterus. So the idea was that most people who suffered from hysteria had to have a uterus and were women. And I think that there is some sort of humor in here, and Gilman always has dark humor in her pieces. She says, yes, my husband's a doctor. Perhaps that is one reason I do not get well faster. Okay, so the setting is of particular importance to us. She talks about it being in ancestral halls. So this is an old house. It's sort of like the master's house, the house of the patriarchy. And this is where she is trapped, right? And this is where she's undergoing the rescue. But I want to take a little closer look at her room. Because if you look closely, we get lots of clues and we get lots of imagery. That is dungeon imagery here. She also mentions the idea of a haunted house at the beginning. And you could say, if we're going with the metaphor of the master's house as being patriarchy, then that house is a haunted house, right? But Gilman is a realist, and she's not going to leave us with this idea. She puts the idea in our mind, but this is not about a haunted house. This is not about ghosts. This is a psychological tale. Okay. So she also has the phrase romantic felicity brought them to this house. And one of the things that the realists were really reacting against and actually hostile towards to some extent was the romantics, because they upheld a lot of the old ideas and were into fanciful flights of imagination. So what we get with Gilman's story is this psychological journey. It's almost like a spiritual psychological journey to awakening in here. So it's almost like she's giving us false bait. Haunted houses, romantics, we're not going to get that here. You might think you're getting that, but you'll let Gilman fool you in that case. The only ghosts we're going to deal with are the ghosts of the past and the ghost of all this male dominance and patriarchy. And that is what Gilman wants to expose and make us aware of. Now, back to the room. You might notice that there are rings on the walls, there's bars on the windows, and the bed is nailed down. This is dungeon imagery or prison house imagery. And this is where she is restrained, not physically restrained, but she is here by medical orders. Okay. There's even this, and of course the wallpaper, which we'll get to in a second, but parts of the wallpaper are destroyed. The bedstead looks like it's been gnawed on. It looks like it has a feeling of an insane asylum, really. And that's all part of the imagery that goes into this feeling of being trapped, right? Just a little bit about the wallpaper. The wallpaper is a pattern. She goes into some depth in describing the wallpaper and keeps coming back to this idea that it's a pattern, okay? And a pattern is a structure. This pattern doesn't make a lot of sense. It's illogical. It does things that are what we would call non-Euclidean, right? It almost kind of defies geometry. And she notices all these strangled heads and bulbous eyeballs in it. It's almost like she's being watched by the wallpaper. We could go with the inference that the wallpaper, the pattern of the wallpaper, the structure of the wallpaper is similar to that pattern of patriarchy. And we'll find that the wallpaper is also bars too, and she can see a woman behind the wallpaper, right? But the idea that this wallpaper defies reason, defies logic, it doesn't make any sense, but it is a structure and a pattern, has a lot of parallels to patriarchy, which Gilman thought was completely illogical, did not follow science. And remember, we had all sorts of scientific breakthroughs and watersheds during this time. And Gilman is like, why are we still following all these old patriarchal traditions? Some things just to note as we go through this is that the moonlight, you want to pay attention to the moonlight. If you want to write about this story, the moonlight is kind of an interesting thing to do, because when the moonlight is bright, it reveals things about the wallpaper. That's when she first realizes the wallpaper is bars. And the moon is a feminine symbol. The moon is often associated with women. In fact, women are associated with the night, and men are associated with the day. Men are sun people, women are night people. And there's all sorts of connections you could make to the menstrual cycle or those sorts of things with the moon and women. And moon goddesses are deities were often goddesses who were associated with the moon. By this, so we're getting this journal, and the narrator gets more fanciful as she goes along in the journal and stays in here. And we get Jenny, who is her sister-in-law. And Jenny seems to be sort of on the side of the patriarchy, allied with John and our narrator's brother. But she seems to want to tear the wallpaper down too. And as the story goes on, John, the doctor, and Jenny, the sister-in-law, are caught staring at the wallpaper, almost like they're trying to figure it out. And Jenny even at one point says that she'd like to take it down too. So there's Jenny is sort of like, the person who, she has this idea that maybe something's weird or something's wrong, but she's not quite to where our narrator is yet. By sections 11 and 12, and I numbered mine, they are not numbered in Gilman's text, but I numbered them just for reference. 11 and 12, the narrator begins to distrust us and John and Jenny. And as she goes even more crazy, she starts to see the woman behind the wallpaper. She also says that the woman gets out and creeps by night, right? And this is more women in the night imagery going with this too. And there's a really creepy scene where she's staring at the wallpaper and the woman behind it shakes it, right? And she's sort of like, whoa. But eventually she starts shaking it with the woman behind the wallpaper to try to tear it down. By the end of the story, the woman has our narrator has completely withdrawn into herself. And she's been trying to tear the wallpaper down. She locks John and Jenny out of the room and throws the key out, and seems to have escaped, even if it's into insanity. And perhaps Gilman is saying this was the only way for women to escape. And it kind of reminds me of Ophelia in Hamlet, who eventually goes crazy, and it's thought maybe she committed suicide, and she is also controlled by the women in her life. So there's this idea that the only agency that women had in these extreme patriarchal situations was to escape by going insane. I wanted to just say last couple of things about the ending of the story. There's a striking um, proclamation of freedom by the narrator at the end of the story, where she makes a claim like, yes, I've escaped in spite of you and Jane. And Jane is a name that we never get in this story until the very end. And this is a question I'm going to leave you with. Who is Jane? She's never mentioned in the story, and she's not Jenny. So think about that. Think about the wallpaper and its significance, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.